Good evening and most welcome to H669. And I will open a new chapter in our lecture series. Just have to mention we're back in Närke in Köllestad, this wonderful hall with chandeliers and even some candlelight somebody lit. Maybe it was lit when we got here, I don't know. Looks very kind. You did. Why, thank you, Kalle. This all started when I was taking a little peek into the new book of Ian McGilchrist. And instead of repeating himself, he's actually taking a new turn, which is so much more interesting. And it was something I never heard about before. Something called Connectivism. Might be the reason I never heard about it. This is connected to education originally. But that just goes to show how different things can be. Because in our series we take knowledge from all areas more or less, so I more than welcome having something coming from education. And it's most interesting. But what could this connective knowledge be, or connectivism? I will try to give some couple of examples because it's a bit hard to get a grip on directly, but it's not overly complicated, I think, so don't be worried. The first thing that strikes me, it's very closely connected, or at least fairly closely connected to the associationism of human will. And the central idea of associationism is this: two things that are relatively similar become connected in the mind. This connection or association in turn allows knowledge about one to be inferred of the other. Because of the association, the knowledge you can infer from one can also be inferred from the other. Thus, if we experience one tiger-like creature and it tried to eat us, then if we see a relevantly similar tiger-like creature, we are led, as Hume would say, naturally and senselessly to believe that it will try to eat us as well. Eventually, a complex of belief, which I try to paint here, or beliefs about tiger-like creatures is formed, and some indeed become strong enough to allow us to contemplate a new and dangerous category of entity given the name tiger or big cat, something like that. This associationism has some similarities to Edward de Bono's idea of tainting. I think he calls it tainting. And that's a general heap of concepts that are associated and have a tendency to trigger each other. They're connected in a web, so to speak. And the connections are likeness. They look like each other. Similarity. And that goes together with the idea of Edward de Bono that there is traits of similarity that regulates how our mind works. And the regularity in itself is the interesting point here. To make it even more specific, the regularity has something to do with how our minds are constructed. This is something that De Bono would say would be, in his example, with the sandbox. Think of a sandbox. Some kid just been there, and there are heaps of sands, and there are also holes where sand is lacking. And then we have a little drizzle coming about. Comes a cloud into the sky, and we have a little drizzle, and water drops began to fall. And what happens? In the beginning, the water drops go all over the place. One ends here, one ends there, and they start pouring over the little hills into the valleys. After a while, they are forming small rivulets. And these rivulets are connecting to rivers, streams at least, and then they become streams. Rivers goes to being profound rivers. And this is likeness in action in the subject. In the object there is a similar process going on. And I think this associationism is pointing both to the inside and the outside, because the tiger-like creatures are like in some general sense as well. And there are various types of associationism, from association of impression postulated by Hume to the similarity of phenomena described by Tversky. And when I say Tversky, I don't mean Barbara Tversky. I mean her husband, the more famous Tversky. Two major types of associationism are relevant here, if you want to understand connectionism. The first is simple associationism, sometimes known as Hebbian Associationism, which is postulated to be, and probably is, foundational in forming of neural connections in the mind. Its applicability to the world outside the mind is much less evident. The principle specifically is that if two neurons fire at the same time, like in the head, a connection will tend to be formed between them. Simultaneous firing of two or more neurons will tend to pair them, you could say. They go in tandem. It becomes friends. This is, of course, an all else being equal hypothesis. The neurons have to be of the same sort of neurons that can form connections. There needs to be some sort of proximity. They have to be close by. And they need to be computationally and physically compatible with each other. A lot like a love story. The second is more interesting. The second may be classified under the inaccurate heading of Boltzmann associationism. And I gather that the name Boltzmann is of the mathematician Boltzmann. Derived from the idea of the Boltzmann machine. This sort of associationism is an expression of thermodynamic forces. Think of it as a network attempting to settle into balance or harmonious state. The idea behind Boltzmann associationism is that a certain amount of energy applied to a system will create a certain amount of kinetics. In other words, your brain goes on thinking even though it's not receiving input. In the absence of external influences to cause Hebbian connections, the brain settles into a stable configuration. There's a lot of words here. But the main point in here is the brain is seeking for some sort of balance. And the whole network tried to settle in some sort of balance. And now we're just talking about the inside. But this inside gets effects with the outside world, because when you have a stable configuration, you have associationism, and then you have almost like concept, but it starts in the head. But it has to do with connections. And the whole idea is that knowledge forms itself in a way. It does not only has to do with the subject. It's a self-forming process. And it's widening perception and making space informative. It informs space. It sorts of look into space, find knowledge in space, take knowledge back and let space do its thing. So you can think about it this way. The connections made in the head are a sort of space, and it plays out space, but it's also connected to the outside. There's a play going on there as well. One could say, to understand this a little bit clearer, here we want to see a closer connection between mind and matter. We want to see similarities in the processes of mind and matter. And connective knowledge, let's say, connective knowledge is too late to pronounce the other one. Connective knowledge has to do with there are connections going on in the outside world, but there are also connections going outside in the head, in the mind. And by having connections in both ends, you have an understanding. And they don't have to be completely similar, but there have to be some sort of likeness. So that's also a way out of this incredibly stupid representationalism. Instead, here you have a system that is self-generating in both ends, both inside and outside. Let me just give you some example of likeness and how this system can work. One thing that could be added to the likeness is relation. Relation is possibly a sort of likeness, but is also different. A relation could be taller than, next to, underneath. It's a sort of quality. More than, less than, higher than, more important than, and so on and so on. And here you have space showing itself, and then we should use the other Tversky, the wife of the Tversky I just mentioned. Barbara Tversky shows that space does its categories itself. It does its dividing, and it also does its decontextualization. Do you remember that?
Yes, Julian Barber spoke about that.
As well, yeah. But the contextualization is the caveman who makes a drawing of buffaloes.
Ah, yes.
And what does he do next? Yeah, he takes one buffalo out of the scene and let that one be separate without the context. And that's called decontextualization. It's the first little step towards more abstract thinking, or thinking as such, I'd say. And we found this in Neolithic caves all the way back to 30,000 years before Christ. It's just incredible. It's close to sensation when Barbara Tversky starts expounding these things. It's just so interesting. And then you see the caveman, actually the caveman who doesn't have a writing system, I imagine their language even to be quite crude. But what can they do? They can recontextualize. They can take this hunter or buffalo or both of them that they took taken out of the scene, and then they could put them into another scene. And you have to realize, for the caveman, all they got was wholeness. We've been complaining in the last couple of days we don't have the wholeness. But for them it was almost the opposite problem. They only had wholeness. They had no tools for separating, making anything distinct. When they stepped out of the world, it was just the whole thing. Nothing was separated. And that's also a big problem. Not as big as the problem we are having, but it's also a big problem. And what happens now? Somebody realized you can actually use some sort of implement, and you can start scratching things on the wall, and then you put something that is paint substance, maybe iron dioxide, something like that, that's red, and you can make scrabbles that look like buffaloes, animals, human beings, hunting, whatever. And you can start making little things that will help your thinking eventually. And the interesting thing, this did not start inside the head. And the message from Barbara Tversky is thinking doesn't come from somewhere in here. It comes from the things we do. And now we start seeing how civilization works and the civilization process. It starts by us using tools. Have we used the tools as the caveman does? Then we can start using this thinking separate almost. But it's always starting with the tool. We can't let loose of reality. We've been trying the last maybe 30, 40 years. And it's this horrible thing called representationalism that destroys everything. But we need to go back to the tools. We need to do the job. And we do the job by thinking. Mind is a tool. It needs to be organized. If it's not organized, it won't work. It's exactly the same with this one. The way you put up the screen, that's how good it's going to work. There's no thinking itself. Still, thinking is using of space. And that's actually what connective knowledge is about as well. It is about how knowledge actually forms. Not some simplified, half-deluded idea. Knowledge just comes to my head and I don't do anything. I do squat. You need to do something. And we've been talking earlier, you need to train your memory. If you don't do that, you won't have a thinking capacity. And that's the same as the caveman did Scrabbles. The quality he made the Scrabbles, that made the quality of the thinking. You cannot inherit good thinking, you need to do it. And I think it's extremely interesting. Thinking is something we do, and we can improve thinking. And this rings a bell, I can imagine. Who else said we can improve thinking?
Heidegger? No.
Frederick Matthias Alexander.
Yes.
What he meant by bad thinking or low thinking esteem or low intelligence, he called it, that's the inability to move in one direction. Because how we move our bodies is dependent on the intelligence. We need to train that intelligence, and that is actually memory training. Memory has nothing to do with remembering things. What you train is your intelligence. That's the only thing you train. You're not interested in remembering all things. Those things will come naturally after a while. But what you need to train is your intelligence. And that's exactly what Alexander says. Train your intelligence and your body would follow. That's why we do memory training, not to remember 1,000 things only. That could also be a good thing. But the main purpose is to train the intelligence, and it doesn't get sharp if we don't train it. And that's actually the idea of the directions as well. I start to realize now the directions did not start in the head of Frederick Matthias Alexander. They started with his Shakespearean education. Because there you have the ordering, there you have the system. It's in Shakespeare. It's not in his body, it's not in his head, it's in Shakespeare. And you have this marvelous order in Shakespeare. Plus the aesthetics. And maybe actually they are different sides of something, a wholeness that has this connective tissue to it. Because you see here, we are not able to separate really. Let's say this is a sonnet by Shakespeare. How can we separate the beauty, maybe that's part could be called beauty, and what we learn about relation? And when I say relation, I don't mean love relation only, I mean taller than, standing next to, in authority of, below, the special relation that Shylock had, for instance. There are so many relations. And for every new relation you learn more about this reality. And that's what this connected knowledge is about. Get more relations, because there are millions of them. And those relations help you organize your intelligence, because it's an organizational system that is not just inside, it's also outside at the same time. And I think for me, it was a definite surprise when I realized the caveman did this on a wall. Before writing, before probably even, as I said before, a good language, and with hardly an inkling of what we normally call civilization. Of course, they had some civilization to them, but it must have been low at that time. And here comes another thing. Something I mentioned before as synergy. You have a synergetic energy here. And that's for every connecting tissue that you establish, you make the system stronger. And do you know what that is? That is the direction. It doesn't matter what sort of connections you make, really. In a way it doesn't. But it's the amount of connections. Because it's the amount of connections that makes the structure strong. And that strongness is intelligence, knowledge. Connecting more and more and more and more. It builds on. And you can even say this goes into infinity. It never ends. I think this has to be 2 lectures, but I will go into another point here. This is actually from a chap called Stephen Downes, Canadian man. Stephen Downes. There is another aspect we haven't mentioned in this lecture, and I don't think we mentioned it in any lecture since Christmas lectures in Hisingen. And that is a point that Stephen Downes does. Because relations, they don't stop at your own head. They continue outside your head. Because loads of that information not only come from the outside world, comes from other people. And that makes the web of knowledge go way outside of yourself. And the more you connect with that, I don't know what to call it, language world knowledge, and that's the knowledge among all people. They are making connection, making big strength. It's almost like a source field. The more connections the source field is made up with, the stronger it becomes. And you can tap the energy of that one. So there is an social other people, and of course this goes back in time as well. You have everything that is inside the history, as Heidegger called Geschichte. And Geschichte is actually the building of networks historically to make them even stronger. So you have three factors here. You have your own interconnectivity that you do in connection with the world. You have the connectivity in the outside world, other people, what sort of connections they do, and how you can tap into that. And then you go back also historically. So you have a vast amount of knowledge there. And I think this is very important to understand, especially history-wise. It goes back so much, and that makes interesting connections, but they're also unique for our place in the world, completely unique. And that uniqueness goes much deeper than we normally think. I think this is logocentric now thinking makes us forget that, but it's rather vast actually. It goes way, way down. And it's almost like we're standing like this, and I start thinking about the ice cone. But think about the ice cone. Think the ice cream cone goes down, and down there is the bottom well of knowledge. And in a way, it goes all the way back to the Neolithic man living in the cave in Lavascourt, it's pronounced, Kalle, or the cave in southern France, like in the Pyrenees. It's Lavascourt?
Lascaux.
Lascaux it is. Think about the Lascaux case. And the last thing I want to add, take a gander at the pictures of Lascaux. They are incredibly beautiful as well. That's just amazing. And there's a funny thing there. They are actually able to depict running animals like these buffalo-like creatures. And I think something
Bisons.
maybe something like that, and something that looks like horses, I'm not pretty sure. But the amazing thing is, when they gallop, they have all their hooves in the air. All their feet, so to speak, hooves, are in the air. And all through Western history, it's not until, I forgot his name, a photographer in the 19th century, that we actually discovered when a horse or buffalo or bison, I don't know what, do galloping, none of the hooves touch the ground in each jump. And we had no idea. We always thought that horses had at least one hoof or two hoofs in the ground. So all paintings done by any artist in the Western Hemisphere since Lascaux have been wrong until this photographer, he takes photos very, very quick at the horses, very quick. So you can see that he has all his hooves in the air at one instance, actually flying. And that took 35,000 years for us to discover. 35,000 years. Nobody had an inkling that would happen. Not even the photographer himself. He was as surprised as everyone else. And people didn't believe him. He had to show the photographs, and then people believed him because he could show photographic evidence. Look, a horse galloping has all his hoof ups in the air. Until next time, I'll I put some time into discovering what's the name of the photographer who made this marvelous discovery.
Susan Sontag.
No, it wasn't Susan Sontag. Was she a photographer?
Yes.
I had no idea. Okay, maybe it was Susan Sontag. You don't
Joking.
know, you're tired. Okay, I think we better end now. Thank you very much for this lecture. I'll get back to Connectivism in 2 or 3 lectures, something like that. Okay, 1990.
Thank you.